Hello, Louisville.
I am so excited about tonight. This particular plenary has been about 6 months in the making. And with me tonight is Calvin Gladney, the brand new, actually not so new, he's just celebrated his year anniversary, President and CEO of Smart Growth America. I am particularly thrilled that Calvin has agreed to not only moderate, but to help curate this session with us tonight. In particular, we have been discussing over the last several months since he's come on, I think I was in his office about 10 days after he started, about how CNU and Smart Growth America can collaborate. A common theme that you have been hearing from me is about the strength of partnerships, about leveraging each other's assets. And there's no other better partner than I can think of in our journey together than Smart Growth America and Calvin Gladney. So tonight, Calvin will be your steward. And I'll let him introduce the session, but I wanted to just introduce Calvin again. So thank you all.
Oh, well, you know, I have a little story. The people in the audience who know me know that I pretty much stay off script, so that's how it's going to go. So many years ago, I was in a little city called Seattle. Anybody here from Seattle? Now, was anybody at CNU Seattle? And was anybody also at the Urban Land Institute meeting at the same time? So I was a young trustee of ULI sitting in the audience, looking up at the stage. And on the stage, I saw a woman, and her name was Lynn. And I said to myself, one day I'm going to be on the stage with her, and we're going to join together and change the world.
All right.
And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you, my friend.
Okay. How's everybody doing tonight? Good. So we're going to focus on kind of three pieces: policy, practice, and politics when it comes to how to get to inclusive development. And I have the honor and privilege of being both a little bit of a speaker, but also moderating a panel, well, let's say curating a discussion between two great guys that I'll introduce to you in a second. But I want to start off with some remarks, and hopefully the slides will appear at some point from the powers that be out there somewhere. Slides? My slides? Ah, there we go, the powers that be. And I'm just going to point into the background and tell them to switch, since I don't also have a clicker up here. So again, Calvin Gladney, we wanted to actually leverage a framing not only of policy, practice, and politics, but also talk about two cities, the city of Detroit and the city of Washington, D.C., and use those as illustrative examples of the sort of do's and don'ts, the best practices and maybe not great practices that are involved with city building, that are involved in inclusive development, and involved in making sure that as we benefit and do the things that we do for places, we also do those same things for people. Next slide. A Tale of Two Cities. Anybody recognize this? I'll just point. This is the Detroit 1967 riots. A Tale of Two Cities. This was Washington, D.C., 1968, after the MLK assassination. If you fast forward to 1991, D.C. was known as the murder capital of the country, and it was on a horrible downward spiral. Now, just to do a little math, and some people told me that if I'm in a room of planners and local officials, there might be a little bit of math and data terror, but I figured it was important to take this concept of gentrification and change and actually quantify it a little bit, and I wanted to specify in DC. So if you look at these numbers and you take the period from 2000 to 2017, you see a couple of things. One thing you see is that household income increased 94% in that time. So when we talk about gentrification, which doesn't have a meaning that relates to race, gentrification means the changing of incomes in an area. We had gentrification in the district. You also saw, and it's also important, that the median sales price increased for homes 125%. And that percentage actually will continue going if you add 2018 or if you go back farther. I mean, it is just, these are sort of easy ways to quantify that change that don't really relate to race, but relate to income and relate to the way things cost. The other thing you'll see is the differentiation between incomes rising and the cost of housing, and they're not parallel. And that's actually one way you can start thinking about affordability, as whether incomes are rising just as fast to keep up with sales prices. But you can also think about gentrification, and it's often talked about in the context of race. And so how did this play out in DC? And the important way to think about this here is, in DC, all types of races increased in population. So just looking at that number doesn't give you detail. What does give you detail is the change in share of racial populations over time. So in the district, if you go back to 2000, black people were 61% of the population. Fast forward to 2017, down to 48%, and that's a 21% drop in African American share of the population as a whole. And so, and you can also see the sort of flip side, it's not necessarily a flip side, but you can also see the change in the share of Caucasian Americans in the District of Columbia. So that sets the context when you think about incomes rising and higher income and likely more educated people moving to the district and sales prices going through the roof, and this real dramatic change in a city that was known, just like the city of Detroit, known for being an African American city, known as Chocolate City, now I would say a little more cappuccino. That's the sort of backdrop to what happened next. I did want to mention, by the way, and Maurice Cox will talk a little bit more in detail about the changes in Detroit over the same period of time and what's happening next, but you can see very specifically that in downtown Detroit has been and continues to be lots of activity. But what you didn't see is the same level of trajectory in sales prices, in change in racial makeup, in incomes. And so one of the questions is why? But beyond that question of why, what are the things that we can learn in the different choices that were made by the public sector, the private sector, the philanthropic sector, developers and planners and urbanists and designers, and how did those different changes, how did those decisions affect the trajectory of the cities? And hopefully in that discussion, you can learn things that you can do to make sure that the development that you work on, that you support, or you lead will be inclusive. That's the framing and the theory of this conversation. This is a picture that I took personally, one block from a development that I worked on in Washington, D.C. in 2018. As you can see, all of these things have come to a head where people thought that putting the words gentrification as racism, and it sat there for a couple of weeks, which meant that a lot of people actually thought that was right, is a central issue that DC has to grapple with, because many people feel like they've been left behind, that the displacement has happened and it's already too late. So one of the framings and things to think about is, are there things that Detroit or the cities in which you work can do now to not end up in the place where you have moments like this? The other thing I'll note is this development actually never happened. Causation, correlation, I don't know. One of the things that you can talk about as a framing issue, and I'll have Jair and Maurice weigh in on these things, is what can a city do, what can projects do to set the stage for inclusive development? What are the kind of core components of the things that you can do? And if you can do those things and learn some of those things today and come away with some ideas from this discussion, we feel like you guys can go preach to the choir, but also be the agents of change that make development more inclusive around the country. Policy, practice, politics. Again, that's our framing. I want to keep putting it up there because you can't do just one of those. You can't just implement the right policies and not have the politics behind you. You can't do the things that you do in practice, irrespective of the policy, and not make sure that all three align. And so I just want to keep going back to that framing, but let's talk a little bit more in detail. And my purpose here is just to give the framing, and Maurice and Jair in Detroit and in DC will give you more details, examples of their projects and things that are going on in their city. But I wanted to give you the framework, the ideas and the concepts. So this is the type of land use and planning, this is the type of design that you guys like, right? Oh, that's the wrong slide from a different presentation. This is Irwin, Tennessee. Does that look a little bit more like the Main Street mix of uses, pedestrian, safety, walkability, livability, the types of things that we're all working on, whether we call ourselves new urbanists, smart growthers, or inclusive developers? Does this look a little more like it? Well, the question is, are we putting in place the land use regulation regime, whether that's a form-based code, whether that's Euclidean zoning that we've just added form-based code elements to it? You don't necessarily have to pass a form-based code to get the elements of that flexibility into that zoning if you can't get to a whole new code. So I just wanted to mention land use and planning as one of the things that has to be done. It's probably obvious to this audience, but I just wanted to mention that you have to do the things to set the stage on the land use side. Otherwise, once the market gets hot, it's too late to try to change the rules. One thing that's not talked about as often is the idea of building a local developer ecosystem so that local developers, and if there are people of color or communities of color, that you actually build the ecosystem of developers who will be around once the market gets hot, so that when you're trying to talk about inclusive development, you're making sure that some of the developers who are actually part of what's next look like the communities that are being revitalized. And that's one of the things that the district has done and did. There'll be some conversation about whether the district did this in a great way. This actual picture, if you see, again, I tend to go off script. I don't know if you see the one guy moving the dirt on the shovel. That was me. That's standing next to Mayor Bowser, and nobody told me it wasn't an action shot, so I just did what I thought was right and what should happen. So you got to set the stage by building a developer ecosystem, and it's not just developers, it's entrepreneurs and small businesses that support the developer ecosystem. So we're also talking about African American, Latinx, and other architects and planners and surveyors and title companies and the like. It needs to be an ecosystem. If you want to get to inclusive development, you need to think about building that ecosystem and that infrastructure before you get to the moment of the market where then you say, well, there's no black developers who can do that scale of project. It's a supply issue. An equity lens. I'm from a small town in New York called Brooklyn. Anybody been there or from there? This is a picture of the barber shop that I used to go to every week. It's called Timbuktu, as you can see on the sign. This is what it looked like the day after Hurricane Sandy. You have to think about your infrastructure, and part of what happened was, well, there was no infrastructure built. We didn't have the pipes, we didn't have the sidewalks, we didn't have the things, we didn't have the support system. So anytime something happened, we couldn't be resilient. Coney Island, Brooklyn could not be resilient. And so one of the questions is, as you're going towards a moment where your market might become warmer and then hot, and it always happens that way. It doesn't go from 0 to 100. It goes from cold to warm, and then suddenly it's too late. The train has left the station. So one of the things you need to think about in all categories is, Are you taking an equity lens and thinking about the equity consequences to all the choices you'll make along the way, so that once things are happening, you've thought about what might happen and you put things in place to either stem the tide or allow people to get on the train before the train leaves the station? And I talked about infrastructure investments and just the idea that if you think about new urbanism, if you think about smart growth, one of the things that we're saying is build where people already are. We don't like sprawl. Build where people have services, build where their jobs already are, build with density, build with intent. Make sure that pedestrians, people in wheelchairs, and bikers and runners all have a safe environment in which they can feel the livability of not just when you're in your car, but when you're using all modes of transportation. You have to think about your infrastructure investments now and not wait till suddenly the neighborhoods change. You can think about a neighborhood like Bloomingdale in Washington, D.C., which was historically African American, and the basements flooded every time it rained. And it wasn't until you saw those changes in race and income come to the neighborhood of Bloomingdale, where now the houses sell for $1 million each, I would say, as a median sales price, and suddenly the district applied for a federal grant to improve the infrastructure. So if you want inclusivity, if you want to do things in an equitable way, you need to think about the infrastructure for all, not just the hottest neighborhoods, not just the highest income neighborhoods, but for those who have suffered through disinvestment, put those infrastructure investments in place. And I know for a fact Maurice and Jair have examples of this in Detroit and DC, but the question is, have you made infrastructure investments that reflect the principles and ideas of new urbanism and smart growth? We're not talking about infrastructure investments to make sure you can have more sprawl. So those are the types of things that I've seen working around the country, both as a consultant, as a developer, and the president of Smart Growth America. Those are the things that have been done to set the stage. But to get to the type of visuals and visions that we all like, but what about politics? Anybody here from the great city of Santa Ana? Well, the great city of Santa Ana, this is a picture of them getting a national planning award for the best plan in the country for their downtown. And so this was an example of, they made a great plan. The plan was so great they won awards. They beat out everybody else. But what they didn't do is get their politics right. This is also the protest of that same plan just weeks later. So if you don't get the politics right, and if we continue on, if you don't talk to the community, if you don't engage, you can do all the planning things correctly. You can put in all the infrastructure investments. You can do the other things to set the stage, but if you don't deal with the politics and work with community in a real way, not a checkbox way, not a, yes, we went to that meeting, and yes, we had a 6 p.m. meeting in a school basement, but in a way that says, this community is going to understand what you're trying to do. I use this example partially because it shows when we think about, new urbanism and smart growth, we say, well, we want a mix of uses, so if we bring the right retail, it'll create this active environment. And we're often talking about creative placemaking and bringing the arts to a community. But if you haven't done the politics right, you haven't had the community discussions, maybe some of the community might think that that art isn't for them. So I just want us to have a holistic sense of setting the stage, and although we're planners and we may not all be politicians, that we have to think about the politics and we have to really get deep into the community. And if we don't, we could do the right retail things. We can bring a coffee shop and we can be in Boland Heights in Los Angeles and have a coffee shop get protested. So we can't just do the things we would normally do the planning that we would normally do. We need to think about this setting of the stage, this city building in a holistic way, and it needs to include the politics and a real sense of how the community thinks about these things. We just can't do the sort of Band-Aids. This is actually a picture from Brazil. I don't know if anybody knows Correteiros Urbanos. But their idea was, let's take these Band-Aids and let's point out to the city the problems, and then that might gain the attention. But I used this slide, and it was up earlier, to show that we can't just do Band-Aids. This setting of the stage has to put real money and resources to these things to show that we mean it. Because once the market is hot, it's too late. Once the market is hot, once there actually is gentrification that is causing displacement, not gentrification alone, once that happens, then the costs are much higher. Trying to do inclusionary zoning through the backs of private developers on deals one by one, then it costs too much and it's too late. So we need to think about these things beforehand and not just do Band-Aids along the way. And I'm sure Maurice will talk about setting the stage in a way that's priceless, in a way that looks real, in a way that sets things up so that when the future happens, you're ready and you have the money available. And I believe Maurice and Jair are almost ready to come up on the stage. So we're going to bring them up as I wrap up. We'll go one more slide. So overall, the real question here is, are we taking a holistic point of view? Are we being the new urbanists that we know and say we are? Are we thinking about the ways to grow in a smart way? Are we thinking about inclusive development in a holistic way, not just as a planner, not just as a local politician or official, not just as an agency director, but taking that holistic approach where if you do these things to set the stage, you can make everything work, you can get to the designs you need. But the number one thing we actually almost certainly have to do and make sure is true is that the rent is not too damn high. Thank you. So next up, I'm going to bring, and let me just do a quick set of introductions. On my far left is Jair Lynch from Washington, D.C. He runs a company called Jair Lynch Real Estate Partners, and he will introduce himself in detail, but he's a private developer and investor and owner in the district, and he'll talk more about things that have happened in the district, his thoughts about these questions of how you set the stage and what to do if you're in a hot market and still create inclusive development. In this tale of two cities, and coming up next to the stage will be Maurice Cox. He's the Director of Planning and Development in the great city of Detroit, where the city will rise again. Maurice, your turn.
Excellent. Thank you for that perfect setup. I'm going to talk a little bit about Detroit, which is not a hot market. I think of it as a slow, sustainable market. And the strategy that we're deploying to ensure equitable development is something across the 139 square miles of the city. If you can go to this slide. So in the end, it's about streets. It's about the quality of life in those streets. It's about public investment in those streets. Problem is, in Detroit, we've got 300 miles of commercially zoned streets. And so how do you shift a street which was really rebuilt for the automobile into a place for people? And very specifically, how do you use capital dollars to create areas of density, areas that are walkable, that attract and retain local investment? Next. It's also about parks. It's about gathering spaces. It's about the civic commons in communities, but in a often untraditional context. So this park is 26 vacant lots that are a result of a depopulation of this neighborhood, gathering 2.5 acres across streets and alleys to create the first neighborhood park in this neighborhood of Fitzgerald. Next one. It's about greenways. So we often talk about mobility and we talk about transit-oriented development. Well, in a slow growth or no growth context, what's the mobility model that implies equity? And so in Detroit, we are laying miles and miles of walking and biking paths because 30% of Detroiters don't own a car, right? And so mobility and bike mobility and using vacant lots as an asset to connect one neighborhood to another or one part of a neighborhood to another, again, is a strategy for equity. Next. It's also about development, right? The kind of development that is right for the context that we're in, a neighborhood development that has character, a kind of a local flavor, and you'll see there's no housing above this commercial corridor because this area can't sustain it. And so trying to create the kind of development that creates character and a sense of place and a sense of local ownership is a part, again, of the strategy. Next. But ultimately, it's about people and working with those who have stayed. And so when people ask, who are we making these investments for, we say it's for those who stayed, not for some phantom magical market that we're chasing, but it's the reward that those residents get for sticking it out through thick and thin with the city of Detroit. So next. And so it's a dispersive strategy. This is not a downtown or downtown adjacent strategy. These are growth areas that have been identified that are miles and miles away from downtown. And so part of the issue of equity is trying to do a strategy that is not just attractive to the empty nesters or the millennials, all who want to live next to a vibrant downtown, but to create vibrancy wherever you can create density. But these are fundamentally single-family neighborhoods that you see highlighted, and it's the roadmap to an inclusive recovery that Detroit is pursuing. So that's my setup, and we'll dig into what that means. But if you have to remember our strategy, it's about streets, it's about parks, it's about greenways, and it's about development with character. Ultimately, it's about people. Okay?
Thanks, Maurice. Jair, why don't you just quickly introduce yourself to give folks context for your remarks, and then we'll just sort of dive into discussion, and I'll ask you some questions, and we'll just get this party started.
Okay. I am really, really excited to be here. Rarely do I get an opportunity to sit in front of thinkers that are really thinking about urbanism and thinking about the future. I am typically in the room with developers, and we are talking about money and cap rates and interest rates and what's happening at the Fed. So this is very refreshing to actually have a better intellectual conversation. I have a firm in Washington, D.C. who made the very deliberate decision to work specifically in that submarket for the last 20 years. And we have developed about $1 billion worth of projects all outside the central business district. And we have another $1 billion worth of projects that are active now, about $500 million of it's under construction, the others in near-term pipeline. And we have literally tried to transform neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood outside the central business district. And that has been in the form of neighborhood assets in the early stages of the maturation of place. That includes recreation centers, that includes gathering spaces, that includes medical primary care facilities, that includes libraries, that includes affordable housing. And we were there at the moment in which these neighborhoods started to move. And it doesn't move in a straight line. It moves more like a hockey stick. Too bad for Boston last night. But once it catches fire, it is very difficult to control it. So we were there as a developer speaking to the politicians saying, you have to go buy this land. You have to put protections in for property tax for homeowners. You've got to control what will be a massive wave of investment that was going to come to these places. We knew because we were building all the key components, and there was predictability and certainty at the political level, in addition to the infrastructure and all the things that Calvin said. And we watched the city not be prepared for the tidal wave that happened. And we participated on all sides of that. So we also are developing market rate housing. We are also developing office. We're also developing retail, again, because we have the philosophy of we are going to complete the entire neighborhood with all the components that go with it. But our work only goes so far. The policies have to be in place in order to be able to make sure that neighborhood is balanced, to make sure that neighborhood is equitable. And so it has to be a partnership between the private sector and the public sector to think through these issues. Because if left just to its own devices, the private sector will go where the most dollars can be made, period. And there will be very little concern about the ramifications of what will happen. We saw that because the same set of developers 2 generations ago went to every greenfield in the suburbs and created all the things that we see now. So developers alone can't be left to do this. It has to be a partnership that creates these wonderful places that we all are striving for.
That makes me ask a question about balance. What's the balance between, as a city official, trying to put a thumb on the scale to make inclusive development happen, but at the same time, particularly in markets that aren't strong growth markets, not ruining the potential success and growth of that market or stopping particularly local or smaller developers from actually being a part of it? How do you guys see that balance? And what are you doing to make sure that you don't put so many constraints or barriers in that you actually become a constraint to the market growth rather than, get to the inclusive development that you seek?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there are 2 types of development contexts for Detroit. There's the downtown development and the downtown adjacent development, and those markets are really warming up. So we have to get out ahead to assure that those will develop equitably. And to do that, we look to policy. So any project that has public money in it in Detroit has a minimum of 20% affordability built in. And this is not like put it in a fund off on the side or put it down the block. It's in the building.
Now, why is that important, by the way? Why is it important to be in the building and not put into a fund that could fund it in other places, which maybe would fund, it would fund more units in that other neighborhood, so we should do it like that because you want more units, don't you, Maurice?
Sure. Well, we want to create a truly mixed income and mixed demographic, if possible, in the same building on the same block. And so for us, it's one thing to build the 800 square foot units somewhere else. It's another thing to build that 800 square foot on the same block as the 25 square foot condo or townhouse. It might be a carriage house, but the social mixing that you will get as a result of people having to park in the same spot, we think can create that kind of socioeconomic mixing that I think we all strive for. So that's one side of it, in markets where there is growth. The other side is trying to induce the market to go to places where they traditionally would not go. And so you're talking about areas that are 3, 4, 5 miles from downtown and has an incredible single-family housing stock. It even has a commercial corridor that runs through it. And how do you get the market to go there? Well, part of it is public investment in the public realm. And so those streets that you see, and there are about 7 of them under construction as we speak, are meant to be the place where public life will happen, where we can set policies that will assure that multifamily and mixed income housing happen in that spot. And we can also set the policy around single family housing. So the areas that I showed the map, and if we could put the map back up, that's slide 35. If you are, we have 18,000 vacant properties, single-family homes in Detroit. So in those areas that you see, we basically have put a moratorium on single-family infill housing until every single one of those existing homes are rehabbed. So that's one policy issue. So you no longer have to worry about these little vinyl boxes popping up in these otherwise stable historic neighborhoods. The other policy move is if you do multifamily housing in these areas, and even more specifically, if you do it in this area where we're coming in and remaking the public realm, we will put money in your deal to assure affordability and to assure that your capital stack works. So we are creating kind of enticements to go to the places where the market doesn't want to go, and we're using policy to get there.
Well, two questions for you, Jair. One, do you have examples, I'm thinking 8th Street as one, of what the city can do and cities can do in terms of public realm improvements and what that does and how is that helpful to the private development community? The second question I have related to Maurice's remarks is, where can a city go too far, where some of the great ideas they have to create inclusive development actually do things that constrain rather than help?
Okay, well, I'll start with the first question. I do think that every city really should be thinking through a return on investment formula. It does not have to turn into a regression analysis, very deep thing, but there should be a clear set of goals and a clear return on that investment. And I will turn to slide 37 for anthology. The district made, through a ravaged corridor of near Union Station in Washington, D.C., a downtown adjacent neighborhood, made a $100 million investment in a streetcar line. But more importantly, they did all the streets, they did all the curbs, they did all the lights, and that brought early investment at a small scale, consistent with the existing fabric that was there on many blocks. So that turned into little bars and little restaurants in former row homes or commercial row homes, and that started the churn. They recognized that they were also needed to create a main street. That main street started helping these businesses with microloans and others. Those are the early seeds that helped those businesses get going and that corridor to go. There were a few big sites, I'm talking multi-acre sites, that were there, and we were one of the first institutional level companies that bought in that area and bought an entire block, primarily because of those early investments, as well as other investments in schools and other things in that neighborhood. The same formula, and we were able to develop about 500,000 square feet of mixed uses of office, residential that you see here, and another office building. But the key to that was that the public investment in the streets and in the streetcar was a signal to the market that there is a continued level of investment. Therefore, there was no need for any public investment in the housing. And so it doesn't always have to come from the housing department to create economic development. It may come from a different component of the government to be able to do it. And I'm telling you, it was DPW, the Department of Public Works, and the schools, and the microloans. Those were the three components, nothing from housing. And we were able to create an environment off the backbone of that accelerated the maturation of this neighborhood, and now there are cranes left and right here. Could there have been other things to be done? I think there could have been value capture in the home ownership appreciation in the blocks right off the main corridor. This is rental housing, but it's the homeowners 3 blocks over that are seeing a rapid run-up in their pricing, and the long-time residents should have been able to get some value capture from the property taxes that we created here 3 blocks away. Make them feel it. Put it on their tax bill that they're getting a $100 discount because we created $1,000 worth of taxes here. Make those folks understand that the changes in the neighborhood are actually helping them. And if they get that tax benefit, I'm just using that as an example, but if they get to see that benefit, then that community is much more tied in to the overall vision, and they see themselves in the overall vision of a place.
Question actually for both of you. What is the role of good design in all of this?
Well, for me, design equals equity. I mean, for me, access...
It's tweetable.
Access to excellence of design, for me, is a question of equity. Will the designs, the developments that we produce in these emerging neighborhoods be as good or better than anything we expect out of our downtown? And that's, that resonates with the ordinary person, that, they see all of this money being showered in our downtowns, and then when we come to neighborhoods, all of a sudden that criteria no longer applies. And I say, to that, I fundamentally push back on that. And when I talk about quality development, quality public realm, when I talk about what it feels to walk down a street and see the investment in that building on the outside where people can touch and feel it, people respond to that from a position of equity, that you value my neighborhood just as much as you do downtown. Now, the question is, how do you set the stage? How do you set the bar? And I think, once again, that's public policy. The first request for proposal, developer proposals in these neighborhoods are almost always public requests for proposals. And we set the criteria, and design is one of the criteria. And we choose developers who advocate for quality design. And then we will underwrite that development to prove the point that design matters. And once we've set that bar, we look to the private sector and we say, okay, now you match this. You match this.
I agree with you, Maurice, but I also think that we have to get real about the amount of the weight of that bar, and there needs to be the political will to be able to do that. In Washington, D.C., we're a city of 700,000 people, and on a per capita basis, it has one of the largest housing production trust funds in the country at $100 million a year. But when we produced affordable housing back in 2003, we were told we were crazy by asking for a subsidy of $35,000 a door. Now, 15 years later, to get design like in slide 41 at Three Tree Flats, we're at $175,000 a door, $200,000 a door. So now this $100 million fund is producing 500 units of housing when the market's producing 10,000 units of housing. So I do agree, and I'm very proud of the building, but I know that there are a ton of housing units that are not getting created because there wasn't the political will to match that design bar, that quality bar, to still produce 3,000 units, to still produce 2,000 units, to still produce 20% of what the market's producing. And that's, to me, is where the policy has to be set up. If the market's running at X and you want an equitable neighborhood, then there has to be the political will to say, I'm going to produce 20% as fast as the market is.
Right. Well, I think the particular situation in a slow growth to no growth market like Detroit is that we have to graft our affordable housing agenda onto the market rate product. So, it's that 20% is the beginning of the...
Why is that?
Well, because we believe in economic mixing, and we are not creating neighborhoods that are segregated. Now, again, we have examples where senior housing is right across the street from a mixed income, mixed typology neighborhood. But by and large, we are not trying to do affordable housing over here and market rate housing over here. And so so we've committed to create 2,000 units of affordable housing, and most of those are grafted. They're a percentage of market rate housing. So that's part of our way of influencing this kind of design agenda. The other part, which is equally important, we haven't really talked about it, is the preservation of the affordable housing that you have. So the most affordable housing is the naturally occurring affordable housing. It's the affordable housing you have. And when we go in and we do all of these infrastructure improvements, all of these public realm improvements, we go in and survey every single federally regulated unit in that neighborhood. And we make a commitment to holding on to them. And that's policy, 10,000. So we know which ones are coming to the end of their life cycle, and we invest in holding on to them, because we know that that's going to be a lot more affordable than trying to create an affordable housing trust fund 10 years after the train has left the station. So, we'll see how this works, but so far we have about 30 projects in the pipeline. They are all mixed income, and they all have public money in them. And they all are trying to set the bar for excellence. And maybe if I have some of my sessions that I'll do tomorrow, I'll be able to show what that looks like.
I wanted to follow up on this point of setting the bar and just kind of go a little macro and talk about planning. One of the things that the district did was to say, let's have a neighborhood scale plan. I'm looking at Matt and others in the audience who were part of kind of neighborhood level planning that happened even prior to markets turning. And I'm wondering from both of your perspectives what the value of that sort of pre-planning before the market is warmed up, and can it go too far, and what's that sort of balance, and what would you advise for folks in the audience who are in those moments of neighborhood planning? Do you have examples of things that were done well in neighborhood plans that help catapult inclusive development, or things that sort of were put into plans that actually didn't help? I'll start with Jair.
Well, I do think planning is very important, and I do think that neighborhood plans and small area plans are a way to align what could be the market as with existing thoughts and an existing framework. That small area plan may result in bonus densities, it may result in all kinds of other things that may attract investment, but then it also may get in a neighborhood completely aligned around one or two components that's very important to them, whether it's a library, whether it's public, or whether it's a coffee shop, or whether it's a grocery store. As you can imagine, DC has gone through a major transformation over the last 20 years, but for a long time, the number one request was to eliminate food deserts and to get grocery stores into Washington, D.C. And one of the things that was very interesting is that we as developers were able to say, we agree with you, city, that is a good return on investment to create grocery-anchored, neighborhood-serving, mixed-use development. There's now a new study out that, as we go back and look over the last 5 years, there's been an 8 to 12% premium in rents as a result of having a mixed-use or mixed-use adjacent grocery-anchored retail center. And that made projects get over the hump to be able to get done. And that was a calling card for people who already lived in that neighborhood, because they were able to benefit from that grocery store that came. So small area plans very much can crystallize where the rallying cry, where the thing is, but I implore every planner that is putting together a small area plan to also get the economics right behind it. That value capture opportunity, that discussion about that should happen at the neighborhood plan so that there's no commitment to the general fund from those property taxes that come in. There's something that comes back to that specific neighborhood. People will have a much more inclined to participate that they got a grocery store and they got a reduction in their water bill or something like that. That's going to mean something to them. And like everything else, it's about politics, and you're going to have to make neighborhood development about neighborhood politics.
So the benefit of a plan, I mean, I think it's everything. I mean, 75% of my staff, we work on these neighborhood frameworks. This is long before development comes,
Right.
and they take about 9 to 12 months to execute, and they bring all of the city departments, it brings private development to observe, to see what a community is saying about what they want to be. So in Detroit, the neighborhood will have had a robust conversation about streets and what kind of streets they want to create, about what kind of parks, what forms of mobility and where, and what the nature of development is going to be received extremely well by this community. So doing these plans eliminates all of the anxiety about the developer coming and telling them what their neighborhood will be. Because we actually do it the exact opposite. The residents declare what they want in their neighborhoods. And, you know, some of it is totally predictable, right? Food and beverage, a sit-down family restaurant, a bakery, a coffee shop, a grocery store. So by the time we've had the conversation with residents that have lived without these day-to-day amenities within walking distance of their home, so when we announce a grocery store, they're like, absolutely, yes, we decided that there would be a grocery store there.
Yeah,
So that's kind of where I'm going.
I agree with you, but as a person who's worked in food deserts, there's nothing better than having people raise their hand to say, how much do you spend a week on groceries? How many times do you go out to eat?
Sure.
Because in a stage 1 neighborhood, the grocery spend is $25 a week per person, maybe $10 million total.
Sure.
And it's $125 in a stage 5 neighborhood, but because of density and other things,
Sure.
it's more like $200 million in grocery, which is why you'll get multiple grocery stores. And
yeah,
that has to be explained.
We don't go to areas that are depleted with population and say, who wants a grocery store? I mean, we're counting rooftops, we're counting spending. So in last year, $2.5 billion of buying power left the city of Detroit to go shop in the suburbs. $2.5 billion. And so in each one of those geographies that I show on the map, we calculated exactly how much people are spending and what they're spending it on. And then we could say, well, we're going to add, 1,000 households here, and this is exactly where it's going to go. Can we attract a national grocer? And they are responding, and they're responding, with a urban footprint that mixes housing above it. But yeah, I mean, we had to first show them that there is buying power in these neighborhoods. They, again, where they fit on the scale that you described. I think the important thing was the benefit of the plan was that we were able to project the future growth of this area. And for the first time, developers said, I see there are going to be 2,000 more residents here, and they could begin to make an economic argument for why.
But in the age of transparency, that data has to get to everybody.
I agree. Well,
that data has to get to that church basement.
Yes.
Broken down in a way that the folks there will digest that. So what's in my pocket and what do I spend, as well as get up to the retailer, as well as get out. I think the days in which the planners are in the back kind of pulling the strings, I love the fact that if that information is out, then everyone's going to be on board and
Right.
everyone's going to be part of it.
And I think the point you make is you're talking about engagement.
Yeah.
And you're talking about like deep engagement. You're talking about residents learning the same time that the practitioners are learning. And so that's very different than a town hall charrette where, you know, we come in with our tools and we're in and out in 4 days. I'm talking about plans that are developed over months and months, and you're literally bringing a community along and sharing with them this information so that they can make informed decisions. Just to make a case, you know, last year, my planning department hosted 250 evening meetings. 250. This stuff takes time. Particularly when you don't have the traditional tools, quite frankly, many of them invented by CNU to tackle the challenges that we see in a slow growth, slow market area. So we can't always answer the question with infill. We can't always answer the question with a light rail. I mean, this is not happening in our community. I have to respond with untraditional tools and wait for the market to respond. I would have loved, I mean, we have lots of areas, they're mostly adjacent to downtown, where you can do mixed-use development. But the development that I showed you there was just a commercial development. It's locally owned, it's one story, it's African-American developed and owned. The city purchased the lot, put it out for RFP, an African-American small developer got it, an African-American designer designed it, and it's going to be locally owned. So I can't stress enough that the tools that we use have to evolve. I mean, what would the members of CNU do if I brought you into a Detroit neighborhood and I said, we are not going to build anything here. We have 400 vacant lots. We have 100 vacant homes. We still have a residential density of maybe 600 families. Okay, go to work. Show us how you're going to transform this neighborhood. And I think what it's doing, at least in Detroit, is forcing us to develop new tools that are not simply infill, higher density, where there is no market for that.
Well, I want to end with a question for both of you that actually relates to tools for your advice for this crowd, which is, what would you say are both a best practice that you would advise planners, urbanists, designers in the audience to make sure that are happening on the work that they do, but also advise them against a specific worst practice? Because I think we spend a lot of time talking about best practices and not about the hiccups and, you know, things that people have done that don't work that we should also help people avoid. So I want to ask both of you to kind of wrap up with those questions.
I've sat on a bunch of Opportunity Zone panels over the last 6 months, as that's been the rage.
They're not going to save the world?
They're not going to save the world, right. So since you gave me the opportunity to end on a downer, no, I'm just kidding. I will start with that and then I'll end on a high note. But I will tell you, it's a very simple fact. Capital and talent is very, very mobile now. And capital will go to the places where it's predictable, where they can see the lane. I had to explain to someone about the majority of developers that I know that are in ULI and the rest usually work in a 2 to 4 year window that they want to get in and get out. They're merchant developers. That's probably 85% of most developers. There are a few developers that work in that, let's call it 0 to 10 year window. And there are a few developers that work on that 0 to 20 year window. So if 85% of them are thinking in such a short time frame, then they will go somewhere else if the plan's too complicated or the entitlements are too complicated. And I think once you get past that and you go find, in cases you're looking, you go find the 5 developers that are out there who will do 20-year investments, 30-year investments, and concentrate on them, or the 10 developers that are working in that 0 to 10-year window and concentrate on them, and then get rid of everyone else if your market's not hot. Then you'll start to be, you're matchmaking in a way that starts to make sense. Because the talent, well, like I said, the money and the talent will go other places if they don't see that they can go do what their business plan and their whole setup works. But to end on a high note, I do think that value capture in neighborhoods is going to be the next big discussion. And having that stay in those places is going to have people there. I also think that progressive planning, form-based codes, good comprehensive plans is going to provide the predictability that people are looking for. And I also think that the mobility of your customers is also going to make lots of places that we thought couldn't work, because because so many people, either through the mobility, traditional mobility methods, or just telecommuting and all the other things, main streets, rural communities are coming back, and they're going to come back strong.
So Detroit is a place of extremes, 139 square miles, 24 square miles of land which is publicly owned, 24 square miles. 80% African American, 10% Latino, only 5% white, 10% white. So when you talk about developing in Detroit, you talk about engaging in folks in Detroit. You're talking about engaging black folks, and they don't lend their trust to just anyone. And so how do you take a discipline, and I'm talking about all of the design disciplines that create these extraordinary public places, that is actually nowhere near as diverse as the city that I'm working in, and how do you win their trust? And so one is, like, who's doing the development? And do they look like me? And if they don't, those majority developers, are they bringing anyone along, building the capacity of women developers, brown and black developers? And how do you create that ecosystem? And Detroit is very, very consciously trying to build that. So there are a lot of successful developers, white developers in Detroit, who have taken new and young and smaller developers under their wing, and they're showing them the ropes. They're not leading those deals. They're learning their craft. And then the city is very specifically taking that graduating class and giving them their first opportunities, whether it be 12 or 24 or 36 units, and building that ecosystem. So I would just say, for all those developers out there who would want to work in Detroit, how many minority developers are you willing to take under your wing and teach them this incredible craft that you have, so that they can work, and then you can work in diverse communities? So one of the best practices that I've seen is watching these extraordinary developers who basically have been working in downtown and downtown adjacent, going into these far-flung neighborhoods that are 99% African American, and they're bringing young African American developers along with them. And I hope that that will lead to a more inclusive and equitable future for who develops Detroit and for whom.
Awesome. Well, let's give these two guys a round of applause. Thank you both.